Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to WITA's 2023 Washington International Trade Conference. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's online program, and we're pleased you can be with us again today, whether you are in person or online. For those of you on Zoom, reminder that if you have to log off and log back on, just use the same link that was sent to you this morning and you can come right back in. For those of us who are here in the Reagan Building, welcome. We're delighted you can join us back here in person. This is the first time we've been back here since 2020. We've had several other events, but the first time the conference has been back in person since February of 2020, so we're delighted to have so many of you back with us today. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that today is Valentine's Day. And in case you missed it, it also means it's Trade Valentine's Day. That's hashtag Trade Valentine. So please don't forget to post those on Twitter today with hashtag WITC 2023. For those of you who are in the room, we'll pass out some heart-shaped note cards, and you can write your Trade Valentines on those, and our staff can post them on Twitter for you if you'd like. If you have time, we'll try to read some of those as well during the break. To introduce our very first speaker today, I'd like to welcome back to the stage Maria Ziba, Vice President of International Affairs for the National Pork Producers Council and a member of WITA's Board of Directors. Maria?
Good morning, everyone. So nice to see everyone in person. I have this distinct honor and pleasure of introducing Senator Crapo from the wonderful state of Idaho. Senator Crapo has been a champion of free trade for a number of years, and we are very excited to see him as ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. We're also really excited to welcome him because this is his first appearance to the international trade community here in Washington, D.C. at a WITA event. On a personal note, I'm really happy that he is able to join us. I represent over 60,000 plus U.S. pork producers, and he has been a great champion of pork, but also U.S. agriculture. So on behalf of the U.S. ag community, we want to welcome him as well and wish him luck, and hopefully we can pass new free trade agreements. That's what the pork industry and ag always wants, but with that, I do want to welcome him and look forward to joining him on the stage. Steve and Senator Crapo, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. I appreciate the chance to be here with all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to use my brief introductory remarks to indicate a very strong disagreement with the direction in our current trade policy in the United States, and then we can discuss that in the panel, I'm sure, as we move forward. Freedom has always informed my thinking on trade. First, because Americans are entitled to freedom, and second, because Americans excel when they are given more freedom. We can maximize freedom for Americans by increasing opportunities to reach overseas customers, including by negotiating for better market access and enforcing our trade rights. The current administration criticizes as a 20th century notion the idea of comprehensive, congressionally approved market access agreements. In fact, in its various initiatives and frameworks, we see no meaningful discussion of market access, of enforcement, intellectual property protection, investment rules, or resolution of technical barriers to trade. In fact, I would argue that such true trade agreements are more of an 18th century idea, since the Declaration of Independence attacked King George, among other reasons, for cutting off America's freedom to trade with the world. History has proven the idea to be worthwhile, particularly in the 20th century, where President Eisenhower challenged Congress to support his call for a more open trading system. He said, if we fail in our trade policy, we may fail in all. Our domestic employment, our standard of living, our security, and the solidarity of the free world are all involved. Ike was right. And he is still right today in the 21st century. From 1950 through at least the first 16 years of this century, trade expansion increased U.S. GDP by $2.1 trillion, or more than $18,000 per household. Over this same period, we strengthened relations with allies and enhanced our economies. Clearly, we should not support just any trade agreement. We need bold, impactful trade agreements, and they can be won only if we are prepared to walk away from the mediocre ones. We must push for the bold agreement because we need prosperity and international support more than ever before. Last year, inflation stole an average of $5,000 from every U.S. household. Even exports in competitive sectors like U.S. agriculture are expected to fall this year in comparison to last. Meanwhile, China is aggressively negotiating new agreements to secure better access for its producers. Today, we need no foreign monarch to cut off our freedom to trade. We're losing that freedom ourselves by simply sitting on the sideline of the international trade arena. Rather than confront China's abusive trade practices, the administration is unfortunately emulating it by adopting a debt-financed industrial policy for us at home, which will add trillions to the U.S. national debt. This is a huge mistake. Competing with China on irresponsible spending is a race that everyone will lose. So what does a bold American trade agreement that increases our freedom look like? For a start, a bold agreement expands opportunities for as many Americans as possible by including commitments for farmers that gets rid of protectionism disguised as safety measures, for innovators that makes sure fruits of their creativity and research will be protected, for service providers, including those in the digital sector, that ensures they do not face discriminatory taxes or data localization restrictions, and manufacturers that recognizes our products, standards, and testing approaches as equivalent to our trading partners. However, no matter how bold the trade agreement, its success depends on our ability to enforce its rules. Even here, the administration is taking a page from China's playbook by allowing long-established trade rules to atrophy. For example, the administration, without any evidence that it might help end the pandemic, waived the American intellectual property rights under the WTO TRIPS agreement. Critically and closer to home, the administration has been lackluster in enforcing the USMCA. Countries watching our inaction are emboldened to adopt even more discriminatory measures, particularly for products and services where Americans are highly competitive. If the administration wants to continue to take a timeout on trade, then Congress will step up, and in a bipartisan fashion. There is bipartisan support for true trade agreement negotiations, and America needs to get engaged. As the branch closest to the people, members of Congress can verify something else that Eisenhower said is true. History does not long entrust the care of freedom to the weak or the timid. We know the American people are neither, and thus deserve a better trade policy. I look forward to working with my congressional colleagues to accomplish just that. Thank you very much. I'll be right back. It's great.
I'd like to welcome to the stage my good friend and the president of WITA's board of directors, Steve Lamar, who's also president of and a CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Ken. And thanks, Senator, for those great opening remarks and really keeping our trade conference really, I think, at the forefront of the discussions today. So I've got a couple of questions for you, and if there's time, we'll toss it to the audience as well. But just to kind of talk about some of the big issues that we have here. So last year, you helped craft a trade package that was approved by the Senate 91-4. And just 91-4, that's a really important number. This is impressive in any year. Last year, I think it was heroic. And do you have any hopes you can repeat that same feat this year?
Yes, I do. And I have to give some credit to my colleague, Senator Wyden, in the Finance Committee. We negotiated that bill together. That's why it got 91 votes. It was bipartisan. And I believe that we can get there. Trade is not a partisan issue and should not be. And even though my remarks were stern today, there is broad support in the Congress for us to get engaged in serious trade negotiations to protect and enhance our trade policies and our economy. And a couple of examples. I believe that you'll recall that the MTB and GSP were a part of that agreement. Yet we did not get that pushed through in the China bill that we did last year, partly because of some partisan battles on completely unrelated trade issues, efforts to push, frankly, social policy and environmental policy into MTB and GSP provisions. But we can get past that, and we can get there. I recently, in the past year or two, did a trip to the Indo-Pacific with a number of my Senate colleagues and House colleagues. And we focused on trade in much of those discussions. And the nations surrounding China in the Indo-Pacific are eager for us to pass MTB and GSP because they want to be our trading partners. They want to expand their economy and their strength with us. But if we don't do it with them, they will have to move to China. And China is openly courting them. And this is one of the reasons why we need to have such an important endeavor in Congress to get at least these measures enhanced and to move forward. We can go into other areas as well, but we've got to get engaged in true trade agreements and expanding our trade policies. In this case, simply reauthorizing our trade policies that have expired to help give a confidence level to our trading partners around the globe.
Thanks. I want to come back to those trade policies in a second, but you opened the door to the Indo-Pacific and talked about some of these other initiatives. So, so the administration has launched a number of initiatives. And I think I'm going to get them all, I hope. The IPEF, the APEP, the TTC, there's the US-UK dialogue, the US-Kenya Strategic and Investment Partnership. They obviously met last week. The US-Taiwan Initiative. These are all address a range of very, very important topics, but none of them are free trade agreements, as a lot of us have talked about. What do you make of this focus? And then what role will Congress have in providing oversight on these initiatives once they come to an agreement of some sort, because they aren't likely going to require congressional approval?
Well, you've raised a couple of very interesting issues there. First of all, whether they're called a framework or an initiative, or there are a lot of other names, they are not trade agreements. They are not trade agreement negotiations because they don't contain, as I mentioned, market access. We're not hearing discussion of market access. We're not hearing discussion of enforceability, intellectual property, investment rules, technical barriers to trade, product standards. And this is what needs to be discussed. So I'm very concerned about this new dynamic. As I indicated in my opening remarks, the administration has refused to engage in trade agreement negotiations. And with regard to what they have done, they've tried to justify it as I don't quite know why they justify not going into trade agreements, but they've tried to say they don't even know for sure whether they have to go to Congress for approval of them, which means they must not contain sufficient policy to require congressional approval. And I just think this is just a huge battle that we are in right now. We have not agreed, and by the way, you'll recall there was a bipartisan letter that went to the administration about these initiatives and frameworks and so forth, saying that we expect them to be submitted to Congress. This is Republican and Democrat on the Finance Committee believe these negotiations, whatever they are, should come to Congress. Part of that is an effort on our part to tell them they need to expand the content of these negotiations to be something worthy of requiring congressional approval. So a lot of battles, if you will, are going on here, struggles. I'm not saying that what's being discussed in these initiatives and frameworks is not important. It is, and it's important for them to be as successful as possible. But we've got to get to the really solid meat of the topic of trade negotiations for us to really get the kinds of results we need.
So, on a related note, Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, and this governs, free trade agreement negotiations, but also sets the guardrails for administration, congressional consultations on trade. It has been expired for a couple of years now. Do you see any opportunity to see that renewed?
Well, it was discussed quite a bit last Congress, and I got this question from reporters and many others throughout the last 2 years. My response every time was, I think there is an opportunity for Trade Promotion Authority to be discussed and perhaps to be authorized by Congress again, but there has to be a trade agreement being negotiated for there to be Trade Promotion Authority granted. That's what we're talking about here. And as long as the administration refuses to actually engage in trade agreement negotiations, I don't think you will see much interest in Congress to even get further into the debate over Trade Promotion Authority. And I want to be clear about this. I do believe that there is a real place for negotiation and the adoption of Trade Promotion Authority in the right circumstances. But right now, I don't believe that there is a will in Congress to get very far down that road until we see some kind of action on the part of the administration to get engaged in trade negotiations. And one other piece of this, we need consultation too. With regard to all of the initiatives and frameworks and so forth that are going on right now, the amount of consultation that we are getting from the U.S. Trade Ambassador and the administration is significantly less than we have received on previous true trade negotiations. If you could compare what happened under the USMCA trade negotiations, the Trump administration put out far more consultation with Congress than we're getting now with regard to these various initiatives. And until we start getting that consultation and being treated as the branch of government under the Constitution that approves trade negotiations, I think you're going to see very little support in Congress for moving further into TPA.
So I'd mentioned before I wanted to come back to the GSP and MTB, and what do you see? What hope do you see from Congress in taking on these programs? GSP, MTB, TAA. Again, these expired programs. Are you worried also that the lengthy expiration of the GSP program might be sending a bad signal for some of the upcoming trade preference programs that are expiring? There's AGOA, there's Haiti. I'm curious your thoughts on what kind of activity we can see this year.
I do believe the fact that Congress has let these programs expire, these policies expire, and that it has lagged for a while now is creating some bad signals. I do not believe, however, that should create a signal that they do not have broad support in Congress. As you mentioned, the 91-4 vote that included them in the last Congress. The point, however, is that they have been pulled into other negotiations. I mentioned earlier the environmental negotiations, the social policy negotiations that are going on. And somehow we have to get past that. But the bottom line here is that it's regrettable that we have let these expire, and Congress needs to take action quickly and swiftly to get them through. I do believe TAA is in a different position. Both MTB and GSP are very strongly bipartisan supported provisions in our trade policy. TAA has generally been more of a partisan issue. It's one that the Republicans have resisted, but which they have agreed to in the context of agreeing to a trade agreement. And so once again, to get back to my point, I know I sound like a broken record here, but if there were an actual trade agreement before Congress, I think that you would see an openness on the Republican side to agree to or to look at the issue of trade adjustment assistance in the context of that trade agreement.
Yeah.
But until there is such a trade agreement, you're not going to see much willingness. There was a push last Congress for us to simply extend TAA and, in fact, put it on steroids with significant enhancements with no trade agreement to accompany it. And that was resisted, as you saw. And it will continue to be resisted. So TAA is in kind of its own separate category. I think it's something that's achievable in the context of trade agreement or ratification.
So in your remarks, you were talking about the intellectual property issues with, like, for example, the TRIPS waiver with respect to COVID vaccines and concerns about whether the administration's included intellectual property in negotiating mandates for, various trade initiatives. What should the U.S. trade policy be with respect to intellectual property?
Well, the U.S. policy should be to protect our intellectual property. And right now, I don't believe the administration has given us a legitimate explanation as to why we should not do that. I mean, why we should have given the TRIPS waiver, and why, if you move into the tax arena, in the OECD negotiations, that we should be much stronger in protecting our intellectual property rights from being our digital trade from being taxed by other jurisdictions. And the bottom line is I continue to hope that we will get to where we can do so. But whether it's the tax negotiations or whether it is the trade negotiations right now, we're not getting a lot of consultation from either the Treasury Department or the U.S. Trade Negotiating Office on either of these contexts. We keep pushing, but we get very little response.
So you brought up China as well, and yesterday we had a lengthy session in the first day of our conference about China. And of course, U.S. competition with China is on everyone's mind. What do you think we can expect from Congress this year on China?
Well, first of all, I believe that, and particularly in the House, although I believe this will also occur in the Senate, you're going to see a lot of hearings and working committees to do the oversight, to understand exactly what's going on and how we should respond to it on everything from not just trade policy, but tax policy and, frankly, national security issues. And those hearings, I think, are going to be probably the biggest focus right now. There's going to be a lot of push, which you're seeing from me here today, to get us to be engaged with China on trade. And I don't mean just with China. There are trade issues with China, but with the Indo-Pacific. And as I indicated, the people, the countries who live or who are in the Indo-Pacific around China, all are eager for us to get engaged. And so I think you will see some increased efforts to try to get us there. And it all comes back to what I started my remarks with today. In the trade arena, and of course in the tax arena, we're having the same kinds of struggles and negotiations. But I think, unfortunately, I haven't seen a budge on the administration's part yet. And you're going to see probably a lot of battling right now in Congress until we can get all of ourselves more on the same page.
So yesterday we also had a great opening session talking about the WTO and dispute settlement issues. And in fact, the WTO technically will turn 30, I think, during this Congress on January 1st, 2025. So, I think everyone will agree that the WTO is at some sort of an inflection point. Ambassador Tai recently challenged some of the decisions, describing those as being on very thin ice when it comes to like the national security considerations. What ideas do you have to address some of these recent concerns or sort of help guide the conversation from a congressional perspective?
Well, there's really two pieces to that. One is, I think we all agree that WTO enforcement, excuse me, simply just takes too long. It is cumbersome, bureaucratic, and difficult. We've got to address the procedures to try to get more effectiveness in trade, in trade enforcement. I've mentioned that several times today. And one of the things, I can't tell you the specifics of how that needs to be done yet, but it needs to be done. We need to have a strong focus in trade negotiations on enforcement so that we can get the policies of enforcement made more efficient and streamlined. But secondly, we need to utilize them, the ones that we have. And I know it's fine to say that our trading partners are not utilizing them fairly. Well, we need to utilize them and utilize them fairly. And I believe that our own trade ambassador and her team need to be much more effective and aggressive at utilizing our trade enforcement options that we do currently have, which will help, I think, to advise us on how to proceed further as we get into the negotiations, if we can get into them, on improving the trade enforcement policies. But this whole question is just another piece of the whole point that I've been trying to make today, which is we've got to get into the negotiations so that we can get agreements with our trading partners that will then help fix the WTO problems and improve them.
Got it. I'm going to open up to see if there's any questions. I think we might have time for one question or so. I thought I saw one back there, but maybe not. So, Nicole.
Steve, why don't we take one over here?
Yeah, let's do that one. Okay, sorry, we got the microphone over there, so let's do that.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for being here. I'm Rory with Autos Drive America. There's been a lot of policies around the world, including the U.S., that have seemed to be kind of incompliant with trade policies. You know, carbon border adjustment, policies around electric vehicles. How can we use trade policy to support greener trade without stifling trade in general?
With regard to climate issues?
Yes.
Well, first of all, let me tell you the wrong ways to do it. In my opinion, it's wrong to attack trade in traditional energy sources, which America has done. President Biden should not have shut down the Keystone Pipeline, should have enhanced our ability to get more aggressively engaged in expanding our U.S. natural gas resources and so forth. So we should not here at home try to, or undercut strong energy sources because of a disagreement on climate policy. It's also wrong, in my opinion, to adopt here at home carbon taxes that will raise the cost for consumers. There are things we can do to deal with it. But finally, it's very wrong to mirror the Chinese style of industrial policy by funneling hundreds of billions of dollars into distorted subsidies into different industries. Every Republican on the Finance Committee signed a letter last year warning that the electric vehicle credits in the reconciliation bill would alienate our allies at the very time we need to work with them, and that is exactly what happened. Those are the wrong ways to approach this. The right way to approach this really is to lift barriers for fairly traded green products. We can get at this sensibly by pursuing environmental goods agreements at the WTO. I mean, there are ways to facilitate moving into industries or moving into endeavors that will help to deal with the climate. But we need to do so, once again, through trade negotiations that enable us to work on these kinds of policies and get the global community focused on the right kinds of goods and the right kinds of movement that we believe is appropriate for climate policy.
Steve, if you may, we have a question that came in through our Zoom feed.
Oh, cool.
That I was going to read, and it reads, can you comment on the committee's agenda and what you believe the U.S. agenda should be with respect to digital trade issues?
Okay. Well, I've referenced digital trade several times here. Digital trade is critical. It's nearly 8 million jobs right now in the U.S., and if we had fair treatment overseas, it could generate much more. But we need to write the rules so that we get real agreements, or China will write these rules in the negotiations that it's engaging in. And so the first thing we need to do, once again, is to get engaged in negotiating so that we get agreement on the digital trade rules. What should these be? I believe that we could focus on the USMCA, which had a chapter dealing with this, and use that as a starting point. No customs duties on digital goods, no data localization, and no turning over source code and algorithms to other governments. On the enforcement side, we need to confront partners who continue to discriminate against our companies, whether through digital services taxes or through regulations that only apply to American companies. So again, we're on the we're on both the tax and the trade side here. Our digital trade in America, our innovation in America needs to be protected. Once again, through agreements and enforcement. And if we will do that, we've already set a sort of a pattern in the USMCA as to how to approach it. And frankly, as I indicated in response to one of the other questions here, a pattern on how not to approach it. We need to approach it in the smart way to protect our industries and then have the ability to enforce that protection of our industries in both the tax arena and in the trade arena.
So I promised the senator, I promised Ken that I would keep everybody on track and that we'd get you back up to the hill to do the people's business. Let me thank you for your comments here, for participating. As a representative of the apparel industry, let me thank you for your wonderful socks as well. Always think that that's important. And,
that's nuclear energy right there.
Very powerful. But appreciate it very much, and thank you so much, and Godspeed. So thank you.
Thank you.